Do you ever wonder where silent film artifacts, film props, and history end up? Well, today I'm going to tell you as we take a visit to the Hollywood Heritage Museum. As always, I'm creator and host Kat Lively. Thank you so much for watching. Please comment, like, and subscribe. Let's get on with the show, shall we? Just kidding. Before we begin, I would like to thank Brian Cooper and the other Brian, he knows who I'm talking about, as well as the entire team of volunteers who work so hard at the Hollywood Heritage Museum. Here I am standing in front of the Hollywood Heritage sign. Since 1985, Hollywood Heritage has funded the preservation, restoration, and maintenance of early Hollywood treasures. The museum features archival photographs from the silent eras of motion pictures, movie props, historic documents, and other movie-related memorabilia. Also featured are historic photographs and postcards of the streets, buildings, and residences of Hollywood during its golden age. The Historical Museum also hosts a number of silent film events. They have a lot of speakers, screenings, slideshows, all with a focus towards Hollywood's early history. The really interesting thing about this history is the building itself. The building, which houses the Hollywood Heritage Museum, was built in 1901 as a stable by the landowner Colonel Robert Northam, whose estate extended to both sides of Vine Street. So this building, before being here on Highland, was actually located on Vine Street. If you're familiar with Hollywood, it is where the Trader Joe's is today. And then they literally picked the building up and moved it onto Selma, which wasn't too far away, before it ended up here. Can you imagine this giant building being lifted on a truck and driven down Hollywood Boulevard? Colonel Northam sold the property in 1903 to Jacob Stern, a realtor invested in the then booming Hollywood estate market. Hollywood became a city that year, and the prohibitionist sentiments of the populace also made it illegal to show movies in Hollywood. Now, this was something I thought was absolutely crazy. Movies used to be illegal in Hollywood. What? It's true. Hollywood merged with the city of Los Angeles in 1910, and in October 1911, the first movie studio was located in the former Blondeau Tavern at Sunset and Gower. So that's the third time that it moved. Theoretically, the second time, and then it moved here, but you get it. It's very confusing. The building moved a lot of times. In December 1913, Cecil B. Demille, famous director of Sunset Boulevard, The Ten Commandments, and Cleopatra, just to name a few, if you've ever heard of any of those films, was a partner in the newly leased form Jesse L. Lasky Feature Play Company, which consisted of Lasky, DeMille, and Mr. Lasky's brother-in-law, you might have heard of him, Samuel Goldwyn. As they traveled to California, DeMille was taken to the studio, and on December 22nd, a lease agreement between the three parties was executed on Hotel Alexandria stationery, followed by a second agreement between Jacob Stern and DeMille, allowing them to sublease the Burns and Revere studio, which is what it was. The Lasky Company successfully produced the first feature-length Western made in Hollywood at this barn, as well as a few other locations. It was called The Squaw Man. The very first film in Hollywood was filmed in this building. Holy cow. When I learned about that, my mind exploded, guys. The Squaw Man was released on Valentine's Day, 1914. At the same time, DeMille bought out the interest of Burns and Revere and entered into lease extensions with Mr. Stern. The original lease price was $250 a month on a month-to-month basis. Can you imagine this big building today going for $250? Not a chance. Maybe, no, not a number even close to that. The Lasky DeMille barn was registered as a California state landmark in 1955 and was placed on the National Register in 2015, 100 years after the arrival of Lasky and DeMille. The museum is owned and operated by, you've seen it and heard it, Hollywood Heritage, a California state nonprofit founded in 1980 by Marion Gibbons, Christy Johnson McAvoy, Francis McKeel, and Susan Peterson St. Francis. It's now located right here in Hollywood on Highland, just down the street from the equally historic Hollywood Legion Theater. Okay, maybe not equally historic. The first film in Hollywood wasn't made there, but I'm sure it was screened there. Appropriately so, we are beginning the tour of the Hollywood Heritage Museum right here in Cecil B. DeMille's former office, which has been kept relatively the same with the additions of donations of his personal belongings from his family members and estate. So this includes his shoes, his typewriter that was his assistant, Stella Stray's, his calendar, his chair, his desk. Everything that you see in this room belonged to Cecil B. DeMille when he actively used this office. As soon as you walk in the room, you are immediately hit, obviously, with a gust of history. For me, I'm a very visual person, and I completely imagine him working at his desk right here, looking at these walls, thinking, making his next move. The man was always 2 steps ahead. However, as I was going through this room, I happened to notice a James Dean poster completely out of place, hiding halfway behind a cabinet. Now, this wouldn't typically seem too odd because it is a place of Hollywood history. However, the Hollywood Heritage Museum specifically focuses on the silent film and very early Hollywood history. They don't focus on the 1950s at all, which was James Dean's era, or should I say decade. So when I saw this, you guys all know, I'm sure by now if you've seen my other videos, how much I love James Dean. So I couldn't help but giggle and find it so absolutely ironically appropriate to find in that room. Unless Cecil B. DeMille, in his last years of life, was a secret, huge James Dean fan. The man died in 1959. James Dean died in 1955. But I hardly think that's the case. So I'm just going to leave it at that. Highly comical, highly ironic. When you walk out of Cecil B. DeMille's office, you are immediately hit with the Hollywood Heritage Museum gift shop, which is incredible. There was definitely a 2-second pause there. Very, very deserved. I did buy a 5 DVD set of Natalie Wood, the Natalie Wood collection. I couldn't not, it was $15. From what I understand, a lot of people donate classic Hollywood DVDs, memorabilia, art. They even have vintage napkins from the Brown Derby. Okay, Kat, let's not show your full nerd. When I stepped inside the full museum where the exhibits and displays are, I'm not gonna lie, I completely lost my words. I was absolutely speechless. They have everything from the camera that Charile Chaplin used to make the film The Great Dictator. They have Buster Keaton's, belongings. They have some of his home cameras that he made home movies on. They have Mabel Normand's Powder Puff and Mirror. They have every issue of Photoplay, which was on display. I don't think I videoed that, but I even talking about it, I'm getting overwhelmed. It was just really, it's one of those places that deserves, you have to go there a few times to really see everything, because when you walk in the doors, you're just hit immediately with this, if you're into classic Hollywood anyway. If you're not, then it's just a bunch of old stuff. But if you appreciate this the way that I do, I was completely overwhelmed in the best possible way. They had, things from the 10 Commandments. They even let me hold a few props from these films, which I had to kind of look at them like, are you sure? I was beside myself, and clearly still am. To me, it's not even so much about the people, Charile Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Cecil B. DeMille. Yes, they were giants, but to me, what I saw was the very beginning of film itself in those pieces, in those artifacts, in these props. This is, ladies and gentlemen, where history was born.
For housekeeping Peters, what he had mentioned was the reason he always had a rabbit's foot in his makeup case is obviously the men had to wear makeup too, just like the actresses. And this is Mabel Normand's powder puff, and as you can see, it was pink. And the actors were afraid to be called powder puffs because, you know, you pick on the men for putting makeup on back in that. So they were actually got the nickname powder puffs. So they went to the rabbit's foot. So that way they wouldn't be called.
It was more manly. It was
exactly.
more masculine. Oh my gosh! Wow.
So I always kind of love that you'll find rabbits feet in these makeup cases, and you knew it was then a men's makeup case because they didn't want to be called the powder puffs. So
that is so. Oh my goodness.
Rouge on there and the pink powder because he actually did use it.
Wow. That's amazing. Thank you. Holy cow. That must be a trip though if you didn't know what it was.
You know, and when I had dug this up from upstairs in our artifacts, it's like I always forget. So when you open it up, you're like, ooh, what's in there?
What is that?
It's just a rabbit's foot.
Oh my goodness.
So if you're not expecting it, it can really... And then you can see all the different eras of the Max Factor too. So usually when you had his face on there like that, that's the earliest Max Factor.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times nowadays you can get your vintage Max Factor, like the big green ones. Those are a little bit later years. But the ones with his face on them are his actual earliest Max Factor pieces you usually get.
Amazing.
Nestor would have been the very first film studio that opened in Hollywood. We would have been the second.
Was that the one that was Sunset and Gower? Or is that something different?
I think that's different. Yeah.
Okay.
So that would have been Bronson Studios, you're probably thinking.
Yeah, maybe.
But Nestor, yeah, they were acquired by Universal, so I guess technically they're still in existence, but because their studio burned down in the 30s, Hollywood Heritage now were the oldest, extent of a studio. But Nestor would have been the very first, because we call this kind of a display at first. Because then we would also have House Peters. Might be getting my facts mixed up because I've been through this, but no, Hobart Bosworth. He was in the very first movie that was ever filmed here in Hollywood. So it's kind of like our first, and then you had the Flying A, Tin Can, which came over here from Flying A. They came from Chicago, American Film Manufacturing Company, but they're the ones that ended up having their studio up in Santa Barbara. Wow. And that's where Mary Miles Minter, Lottie Pickford, a lot of them worked for the Flying A Studios.
It's amazing. Thank you for sharing that story.
For the remainder of the video, I feel that a virtual museum experience is absolutely necessary. Therefore, I'm not going to narrate it. I want you to virtually experience this as much as possible. And if you have any questions about any of the pieces, please leave a comment, send me a message, and I will do my best to answer them.